Ditch those clowns and jokers. Join me in the middle with your independent minds. All you've got to do is click the subscribe button and ring that little bell, and you'll then get the most independent presentations on all of YouTube. Thanks for watching. Today is sentencing day for Derek Chauvin. What's the appropriate punishment? Chauvin was convicted April 20 of second-degree unintentional murder, second-degree manslaughter, third-degree murder in the death of George Floyd. At the website today, smerconish.com, I'm asking, which is closest to the appropriate sentence in your mind? Time served? 12 and a half years? That would be 150 months. That's how they'll express the sentence later today. Or 30 years? Which is closest? Make sure you're voting at smerconish.com and giving me an answer. In my social media feeds right now is a great piece from NBC that was written by my next guest, Janelle Griffith, who's a national reporter for NBC News focusing on issues of race and policing, provides a great deal of background about the judge who will make this decision. Janelle, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me and for highlighting my story. I appreciate it.
Well, I thought it was well done, which is why I wanted to do it. Judge Peter Cahill, talk to us about him. Who is he? What is his experience in similar matters?
So I wanted to try to glean an understanding of how he might sentence Derek Chauvin. So I obtained his sentencing records specifically for how he has sentenced people who were convicted of second-degree murder. And I also spoke to people who know him, people who have worked with him, lawyers who have appeared before him, lawyers who have tried cases against him, and they used a lot of the same words to describe him. They said that he is someone who was very intelligent, someone who was very focused on details, someone who's very thorough, and they also said he was someone who is very fair. And I asked them, even in instances where he ruled against you or where you might have lost a case against him, and they said, yes, absolutely. And one man he worked with Derek Chauvin many years ago in the 80s, he said that he feels like whenever he sees a sentence, he worked with Judge Cahill, many years ago, and he said that whenever he sees a sentence that Judge Cahill has handed down, he always thinks to himself he would have agreed with that, and he probably would have decided it the same way. So back to the 6 instances where he sentenced someone to second-degree murder. In the most recent instance where he sentenced someone to unintentional second-degree murder, which is the top charge that Derek Chauvin will be sentenced on under the state sentencing guidelines, Judge Cahill sentenced that man to 15 years in jail. Now, if we're comparing the two, you could expect Derek Chauvin to get at least 15 years in jail, but we know that there were aggravating factors in George Floyd's death that will allow Judge Cahill, if he sees fit, to go above that sentence, the 15-year mark.
So a couple of reactions. First of all, the interviews that you conducted with people who have worked with Judge Cahill, I thought the result was very impressive. I mean, even those, as you point out, who've been on the opposite side of the fence with him in private practice or have appeared in front of him, they all seem to suggest that he's a person of a very high ethical standards. And that was my impression, for what it's worth, as I watched this trial very closely, because here was a very controversial case that played itself out on national television, and there really wasn't a whiff of controversy about Judge Cahill. He was pretty firm and fair and consistent. And unlike, for those of us who remember the O.J. Simpson case, unlike the way in which Judge Lance Ito comported himself, seeming to relish the limelight, this guy is pretty low key and straightforward.
It's funny that you bring up Judge Lance Ito, because one of the sources I spoke to for my story said exactly that. They said that he is no Judge Ito. He was not trying to gain any media attention from this. He didn't want the focus to be on him. He recognized what was at stake. And what was at stake was that there was a victim in this situation. By definition, that's not me editorializing. There was a victim in the situation, that was George Floyd, and that there was someone whose life is at stake now Derek Chauvin, he stands to serve a lengthy prison sentence. And Judge Cahill's focus was on what was going on in court. He wanted to block out all of the noise. He didn't want himself to be the focus. He wasn't concerned with what was going on outside of the court. He was focused on what he could control within the courtroom. And that was all his eyes were on, essentially. That was his priority.
Janelle, your reporting also points out that the prosecution wants more than 30 years. The defense say, well, probation, he's served enough. Neither of those things probably will happen. What do the guidelines suggest?
So under Minnesota state guidelines, someone like Derek Chauvin, who has no criminal history, who was convicted of unintentional second-degree murder, the presumptive sentence would be 12 and a half years and a maximum of 15 years. Now, the prosecution wants the judge to sentence him to 30 years, and the reason being is because they said that there were multiple aggravating factors, including that they said he treated George Floyd with particular cruelty. There were children present who witnessed George Floyd's final moments. They said he abused his authority and trust as a police officer. And they said the fourth one was that he committed his crime as part of a group. There were 3 other Minneapolis police officers there who were involved in the arrest. Judge Cahill agreed with the prosecutors that there were 4 aggravating factors in this case. And it's hard to fathom that he would agree with them that there were those 4 factors and still stay within the 15 years. Just as someone who covered the case closely from day one, I do think he's going to go above the 15 for the simple fact that he agreed with the prosecution that these 4 aggravating factors were relevant in George Floyd's death. Now, Derek Chauvin's attorney, Eric Nelson, has asked that he be sentenced to probation with time served, or that there be a deviation from the sentencing guidelines, that the judge go below the sentencing guidelines. I don't think that's likely from the legal experts I've spoken to and just my own knowledge from reporting this case. I don't see that the judge will give him probation or go below the sentencing guidelines. And the people who know Judge Cahill that I referenced in my story you're highlighting, they said they absolutely do not think he will go below the sentencing guidelines whatsoever.
In your reporting, and you made reference to this, you went back and you actually obtained the records very wisely to see, well, what has Judge Cahill done in similar circumstances? He comes onto the bench in 2008. That's the year that he's elected. He has sentenced 6 people convicted of second-degree murder to prison. That's the most serious charge. They received terms ranging from 12 and a half years to 40 years. Tell us about that most recent case of sentencing on unintentional second-degree murder.
So one thing I just want to note is that it was really hard to compare this case to any other. Derek Chauvin was only the 2nd police officer in the entire state ever convicted of murdering someone while on duty. That said, I still pulled the records to try to glean some kind of understanding. And the person that Judge Cahill sentenced to 15 years for unintentional murder in the most recent instance, that man killed his mother. He violently attacked his mother and killed her and attacked his father. But his father had told authorities that he believed his son was under the influence of drugs at the time of the attack. So I imagine that that was what Judge Cahill factored in when he delivered that sentence. Just for the murder of his mother, Judge Cahill sentenced him to 15 years, and then for the violent attack on his father, he got an additional 7. So again, given that Derek Chauvin was convicted on the same charge, it's hard to imagine why Judge Cahill wouldn't sentence him to at least 15 years.
And one other dynamic to this case is that after we get through today, and of course, Derek Chauvin is appealing his conviction, there will still be a federal component to what he faces.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that you bring that up. And that is the reason why I don't anticipate we will hear from Derek Chauvin at all today in court, or if we do, it will be a very carefully crafted statement where he does not admit any wrongdoing or implicate himself, because whatever he says today, if he says anything at all, that could be used against him in his federal trial. He and the 3 other officers who were at the scene, who were involved in the arrest of George Floyd, they face charges, federal charges that they violated George Floyd's civil rights. And Derek Chauvin faces an additional charge that he had mistreated a teenager during a separate arrest years ago. So, and those are serious charges, they're federal charges. Judge Cahill delayed the trial of the 3 other former officers because he wants the federal case to go forward first. So he knows what's at stake as well. The federal charges are very serious, and he's treating them very seriously. And it will be interesting to see if he speaks at all today, because like you said, we have this looming federal case, and anything he says could be, deeply scrutinized later.
So you haven't said flat out, and I'm not going to push you to say flat out, where do you think it ends? My hunch is that you think it's somewhere in the 15-year range. I think it's probably in the 12.5 to 15-year range. And what neither of us knows for sure is, will people be accepting of that kind of a sentence if that's where it ends? Any thoughts on that?
So I personally wouldn't be surprised if Judge Cahill went in the 20 to 25 range.
Oh, okay.
And the reason being is because I definitely think he's going to do a minimum of 15. That is, I think, a given at this point, just judging from his sentencing history and people who know him closely and have followed his career. But I just think that the aggravating factors are what are at issue here. And I think he issued a 6-page ruling last month where he ruled on whether he had agreed with the prosecution that they had proved these aggravating factors or whether he disagreed. They had argued there were 5 factors. The judge agreed with 4. And I think all he needs is one factor to go above the sentencing guidelines. And here, we can't forget that he has 4. There are 4 factors present in this case. So let's assume even he gives him 1 year per factor, 2 years per factor. That's still a significant amount of time when you add on the starting point of the presumptive sentence.
Okay, I was letting you off easy, but you gave me the answer. 20 to 25 is where you think this thing ends up.
I think so. I could be totally wrong. We'll see. But that's what I think, just because of the aggravating factors being weighed in.
Janelle, that was excellent. Thank you for writing the piece. I've circulated it to the best of my ability, and I hope that people who want more information about this case will read in on your reporting. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me and highlighting my work.